But there's something about Van Gogh's legacy which is much more important than his fathering this or that ism of modern art. Vincent's passionate belief was that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. Today we're going to look at the letter that Vincent van Gogh wrote to his mother on the 5th of June 1890, so 130 years ago today. On the same day he wrote a letter to his sister Wilhelmine. That's actually an amazing letter, and I really wish I had the energy to go through that with you as well. He also wrote a third letter on the 5th. He was very, I guess, energetic, had a lot to say, wanted to get through a lot of the family stuff, the family correspondence on the 5th. And so, as I say, he wrote 3 letters. In this episode, we're only going to deal with the one letter, the letter to his mother, and we'll do the other letters over the course of the weekend. I might also be doing another episode on Madeleine McCann just because of the international news that has been happening. It's kind of crazy how people seem to have just developed amnesia. You know, wow, could this guy be the abductor kind of thing? Anyway, I will sort of attend to that. I do kind of want to have a discussion with an Australian who's read my books and also knows the case. I'm just struggling a little bit to get hold of her, so if that's not going to happen, then I will do it just by myself again, but I would prefer to do it with her. I'm just trying to, because we're in different time zones, struggling a little bit to get hold of her. By the way, I did actually email Gonzalo Amaral, and so if I haven't received a response from him, but we're also going to look at what he says in his book about this guy, Christian Bruckner, and what Kate McCann says about him in her book. So we'll look at that in coverage of the McCann case coming this weekend. So without further ado, let's deal with this letter from Van Gogh to his mother. Now, before we even get to it, it's probably important just to highlight that in this letter and the letter to his sister and the letter to Theo, he talks about Dr. Gachet in all 3 letters. And the important thing with the 3 letters is each one gives a little bit of a different portrait of what is going on when Vincent goes to visit him. Who is there? And we'll find out, for example, that there's also, besides Marguerite Gachet, there's also a young son that is at home. And he also talks a little bit about his wife, his departed wife, what effect that has had on the doctor. So if we go through this letter, Vincent writes, "Dear Mother, thank you very much for your last letter, which I haven't answered yet. Vil, that's Wilhelmine, that's his sister, told me that you've been to Newnan again." Newnan is where he grew up. He also spent a little bit of time, I think he went back to Newnan as an older guy and lived with his family as a bit of a dropout. I actually visited Newnan when I was in the Netherlands last year as well. Anyway, he says, "I can understand so very well, and I'm already longing to hear from you how you found things there and visited old friends. Time passes quickly, although some days drag. And it was with much interest that I heard that Will's been working at the Walloon Hospital. I didn't actually intend to go back to Paris again, and I would have stayed there another year had it not been that the last time I wasn't well. I definitely had to attribute it in part to the effect that other people's illness had on me." So what he's saying is, he's saying being in Paris hasn't been very good for him, and he attributes being ill to other people's illnesses, which is actually a pretty accurate diagnosis when you're talking about syphilis. You get syphilis from somebody else. I don't know whether he knew that, but he's certainly right about it. And it probably was best for him not to be, even in a place like Arles or Paris, because there were brothels in those places. So a little town like Auvers-sur-Oise probably wouldn't have a brothel. Don't quote me on that. I mean, it might, but it's a really, really small little place. So it's hard to imagine, especially in the kind of farming community, that you would necessarily have that kind of thing. I would just imagine it would stick out, whereas in a city it would be sort of commonplace. He goes on to say that I decided that it was time to change surroundings if I wanted to preserve my capacity for work, such as it is, and what remains to me of common sense. So, if you're going to say Van Gogh is mad, suffering from madness or whatever, that doesn't sound like what he thinks it is. He talks about, well, why did he leave the asylum? Well, he wanted to change the asylum to preserve his capacity to work, so that he could work. Really doesn't sound like a madman. And he talks about common sense. So he is saying, something about his sanity, but he doesn't use the word sanity. He talks about, his common sense. He talks about writing to Dr. Peyron this very day. So apparently he wrote a letter to Dr. Peyron as well on the 5th. So 4 letters in all. Now, why this flurry of letters? One reason may have been he's aware that his brother has plans to go and see his family. And so it's almost like Van Gogh is warding them off by alerting the family, by writing to his family. Bear in mind, he doesn't write to his mother or sister that often. And now he's writing to them is almost as if to say, hi, I'm around. And by the way, Theo's not going to be visiting you the whole time because he's going to be visiting me. And he's trying to sort of just stir things up a bit so that he's part of the whole dynamic, right? He's trying to kind of ingratiate himself, I think, a little bit with his, his mother is a bit of a disapproving person in terms of her eldest son. And partly because he hasn't, made something of his life. He hasn't found a wife. He hasn't really got a good job. And so he's a bit of an embarrassment, I guess, to the Van Goghs. He goes on to say, I'd had words with him about it, but we still parted on good terms. And he'd asked Theo for good news of me. So yeah, Van Gogh's kind of telling his mother, I've got some pretty good relationships with people, right? Bear in mind, the scandal of the ear incident and what happened with Gauguin is obviously something that he probably suspects is in the minds of his family members, respective family members. He goes on to say, I was very fond of him, meaning Dr. Peyron, and for his part he made a distinction to my advantage between me and others of his patients. So there you have it in black and white, where he basically says, I'm grateful to this doctor because he didn't treat me like the other patients at the asylum. He kind of gave me kind of the benefit of the doubt. He gave me, I was sort of like an outpatient. So there you actually see it acknowledged. It's not the only acknowledgement, but there you have it. He goes on to say, and it's the case that if I ever wanted to go back, it would be as if we were with friends. He goes on to say, but the pleasure of seeing Theo again and meeting Joe, who seems to me sensible and warm-hearted and uncomplicated, and my new little namesake, that's a reference to the child. He says, and further to be back among painters and immersed again in all the conflict and discussion, and above all work in the painters' little world of their own. All this distraction has a favourable effect, it seems to me, insofar as the symptoms of the malady, which are like its thermometer, have disappeared altogether recently, although I've learned that one may not make too much of that. So Van Gogh's telling his mother that the symptoms of whatever he has have disappeared completely. Right? He's saying within, around about 10 days of arriving in Auvers, he's completely fine. He's well. Does that sound like a guy who's suicidal when he's saying that he's moved to a place to be well, he is well, he's recovered his common sense, he's working, and all the symptoms of whatever was wrong with him have disappeared. Does that sound like a suicidal person? Does that sound like a guy in despair? And then he makes a reference to Dr. Gachet. Without actually mentioning his name, he says, "The doctor here has been very kind to me. I can go to his home as often as I like, and he's very well informed about what's going on among painters these days." Now, I just want to remind you that when he lived with Paul Gauguin, Gauguin was also very well informed about art, and what happened? They ended up having huge rows. They ended up having electric arguments. So when it comes to someone knowing a lot about art, and Vincent van Gogh being at close quarters with them for an extended period, it's kind of a recipe for conflict, for arguments, isn't it? They're going to have a disagreement about how one should think about art and artists and the whole thing. Just something to bear in mind. He goes on to say, again, he's referring to Dr. Gachet, but he doesn't say his name. He says, he's very nervous himself. Most probably that hasn't improved since his wife's death. He has 2 children, a girl of 19 and a boy of 16. He tells me that in my case, working is still the best way to keep on top of it. So here he is explicit about the doctor's treatment, which is just work. Does that sound like someone who has some kind of serious illness that just go back to work? Basically, it sounds like he's saying, do what you love, just stick with that. It is interesting that he describes the doctor as very nervous himself, right? And he says that hasn't improved. That's this nervousness, paranoia, whatever you want to call it, anxiety, hasn't changed since his wife's death. And he doesn't talk about why the doctor's wife died. When you research his wife, Blanche Castet, there's very little known about her except that Dr. Gachet married her in 1868, and her father was a cork merchant, and she was a talented pianist. So it's kind of ironic that Van Gogh would paint her daughter playing on the piano. Next, Vincent writes, in the last fortnight or 3 weeks that I was in Saint-Remy, I worked from early in the morning until the evening without stopping, and only stayed in Paris for a few days and got started again straight away here. So again, you're getting a kind of a sense that even the time that he was in the asylum, he maintained a pretty impressive work ethic. And now that he's in Orvers, his work ethic is continuing regardless. Again, you don't get a sense of that this guy is so struck down by illness that he's unable to function, that he's debilitated, that he can't think. You don't get that sense at all. You also don't get a sense that he's not motivated, or he's despairing, or he's unhappy, or he's lost the will to work or live or think or whatever. You just don't get that sense. You get the sense instead that he's motivated and has purpose and has this kind of a sense of mission. Then he describes his arrival in Paris. He says, Theo was waiting for me at the station, and my first impression was that he looked paler than when I left. And this is quite an astute observation, because 6 months from around about now, maybe a little bit longer, 7, Theo will be dead. So Theo looking paler wasn't Vincent's imagination. And there will be additional comments about Theo that come up. You should treat that with, I don't want to say respect, but certainly treat it with pay attention to it, because Theo would soon be dead as well. These aren't empty observations. They're based on someone who's not going to be around in 6 months, 7 months. So he says, Talking to him and seeing how he was at home, I was encouraged, although he was coughing. But it really is true that he has not got worse during that time. So he's saying his brother's health hasn't deteriorated, but he has been coughing. She describes him as pale and coughing. So that is quite sad and unfortunate that both these Van Gogh brothers are having problems with their health in their late 30s. And although you don't hear much about Theo, his health is also imperiled. And he goes on to say, so even if it were to remain the same, referring to his brother's health, he says, I would almost dare believe that this might already be counted as something gained. He's saying the fact that his brother's health hasn't gotten worse, that it's just remained the same, is good. He says, and next year you'll get stronger rather than weaken. And obviously, Theo never got to see the next year, or not much of it. He died on the 25th of January 1891 at age 33, so he was a very young man, but he would ultimately not really get to see much of the following year. Van Gogh goes on to say it's a matter of patience, his constitution and the circumstances of his life. He goes on to say, I heard some details about Cor from them, meaning their younger brother, and Cor van Gogh went to South Africa as a young man, and he says, give him my warmest regards when you write and tell him that I'm back again. I'd write to him, but it's such a very different profession, his and mine. It's quite interesting that he says, give Cor my regards, but I'm not really going to write to him myself. So, and the flip side of it is, did Cor write to him while he was in the asylum? So there seems to be a bit of a coolness between the eldest brother and the youngest brother, doesn't there? So he goes on to say, Theo's holidays are approaching, and so you'll be seeing them again quite soon. They're also planning to come here for a couple of days because we only saw each other briefly and hurriedly. So Van Gogh's putting up his hand and kind of saying, I'm going to see them a little bit, and you can as well, but just bear in mind this is what's kind of in the offing. And then he describes the village life at Auvers-sur-Oise. He says, it's cripplingly expensive in the village here, but Gachet, the doctor, tells me it's just the same in all the villages around here, and he's really feeling the pinch himself compared with before. And he says, and to start with, I need to stay close to a doctor whom I know, and I can pay him in paintings, and I wouldn't be able to do that with somebody else should something happen so that I needed his help. So he's kind of just justifying his relationship and his friendship, and there once again you kind of do get the sense that although Van Gogh didn't necessarily sell his art in his lifetime, much of his art in his lifetime, they did have a certain degree of currency. He could get a certain amount of resources or perhaps food, lodging in exchange for painting someone's portrait, right? He refers to Dr. Gachet feeling the pinch, but Dr. Gachet actually inherited a family fortune in 1870. So 20 years earlier, Gachet, inherited a certain amount, and so that I think gave him the opportunity to sort of be a man of leisure to some extent, and pursue his interests, including art. One thing that I can tell you about his wife is that she had, I think, tuberculosis. So you kind of have a situation where a doctor loses his own wife, right? And now Van Gogh is going to the same doctor to be his patient and put in his care. And if you go on the Wikipedia page, Dr. Gachet is well known to be criticized for the fact that, you know, Van Gogh wasn't in his care for very long when he died. You know, it was literally a case of Van Gogh coming under the doctor's sort of care and custody for 10 weeks, and after that he was dead. I mean, what does that say about the doctor, regardless of whether you want to accuse him of murder? What does that say about his skill as a doctor? And for all Vincent's talk about the healthiness of being in the countryside, Dr. Gachet's wife died not in a country but in an apartment in 1875, so 15 years earlier. Something else that's probably worth mentioning is there was a housekeeper, Mademoiselle Chevalier, and she was hired to look after the home and the children. Dr. Gachet never remarried. If anything, in that sort of vacuum of his wife's absence, he took a interest in art, and that is part of the reason why I met Van Gogh. So you kind of have a situation where the doctor in this town is talking about struggling financially, and is into this setting that Vincent arrives virtually penniless, and he's relying kind of, first of all, from handouts from Theo, who's got his own troubles, but also he's kind of hoping that he's going to get some charity and get a couple of breaks from this doctor. But as I said, the doctor's, according to this letter, telling him that he's feeling the pinch himself. So how much can Vincent really rely on this doctor to help him kind of economically, if that makes sense? And so Vincent wraps up saying, well, I'll say goodbye now because I have to go out, hoping that you and Will receive this in good health and embraced in thought. Your loving Vincent. And this letter was actually written in Dutch, so that's why it opens up Beste Moeder, dear mother, right? So I'm not going to take it further than that, except to say that the letter to Wilhelmine is quite an incredible letter. I'm looking forward to going through that with you either tomorrow or Sunday. So I will see you guys then. Thank you for listening.